Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Woodrow Wilson, and the focus is, who's running the country? The year is 1919, it's the end of September, and Wilson has just returned from his tour around the country where he was giving speeches to advocate for the League of Nations, trying to influence the United States Senate, which was still yet to vote on his treaty. But his body had broken down. In Pueblo, Colorado, they called off the rest of the trip, and Dr. Cary Grayson had ordered complete rest. Wilson had gone numb on his left side, his headaches, intestinal problems. His body was broken down and he needed a break. The question was, did this order for rest come too late? 4 days later, Woodrow Wilson was in his bathroom and he collapsed. He went unconscious. His wife called the doctors in, and everyone, frankly, was scared because his paralysis now was solidly entrenched on his left side of his body. There was droopiness on the left side of his face. He had been diagnosed with a serious ischemic stroke. This was not the first stroke in Wilson's life, but clearly the most serious. His body had all but given out. So the question was now, with the President of the United States, what do you do? Well, Edith Wilson wrote a couple of decades later in her memoirs the guidance that she got from one of the specialists that Dr. Grayson had brought in. His name was Dr. Francis Dercum. And Dercum said, he leaned towards me and said, "Madam, it is a grave situation, but I think you can solve it. Have everything come to you. Weigh the importance of each matter and see if it is possible by consultations with the respective heads of the departments to solve them without the guidance of your husband. In this way, you can save him a great deal. But always keep in mind that every time you take him a new anxiety or problem to excite him, you are turning a knife in an open wound. His nerves are crying out for rest, and any excitement is torture to him." Well, Edith Wilson then responded to Dr. Dercum and said, "Well, look, if it's this bad, why don't we just have my husband resign and pass the burdens of the office onto the Vice President, Thomas Marshall?" And Dercum, according to Edith Wilson, said, "Don't do that. For Mr. Wilson to resign would have a bad effect on the country and a serious effect on our patient. He has staked his life and made his promise to the world to do all in his power to get the treaty ratified and make the League of Nations complete. If he resigns, the greatest incentive to recovery is gone, and as his mind is clear as crystal, he can still do more with even a maimed body than anyone else." So Edith Wilson agreed. She wrote that so began my stewardship. I studied every paper sent from the different secretaries or senators and tried to digest and present in tabloid form the things that, despite my vigilance, had to go to the president. I myself never made a single decision regarding the disposition of public affairs. The only decision that was mine was what was important and what was not, and the very important decision of when to present matters to my husband. Well, let's talk about some of these comments, because that last part is pretty disingenuous. The fact is that Edith Wilson had a huge impact on the public affairs of the country just by deciding the few things that the president would actually see. Most of the stuff that a president would normally see, he did not, because she kept it out. While she might not have made a decision on a policy matter itself, she made lots of decisions on what policies matters would even go to the President of the United States. So she clearly impacted the presidency and public affairs for the next year and a half of Wilson's presidency. Now, why did she do this? Well, partly was, according to her, this guidance that she got from the doctors, but she also made it clear in those memoirs that Woodrow Wilson was first my beloved husband, whose life I was trying to save, fighting with my back to the wall. After that, he was the President of the United States. Well, for Edith Wilson, that's fine. But for 100 million people, that was probably not fine, because they had elected Woodrow Wilson President of the United States. Nobody had elected Edith Wilson to anything. And now the people around the president, doctors, nurses, and Edith Wilson, nobody elected, they're the ones deciding what the president would see and what he wouldn't see. And all of this was pretty much happening in a shroud of mystery. Woodrow Wilson had been a huge fan of transparency in government. Well, that was gone by the wayside. Edith Wilson, in fact, had told the doctors, one of the things that she did engage with those doctors on was to say only general observations should be shared with the public. They don't need to see a lot of these details. She was trying to protect her husband, but in doing so, she was shielding the President of the United States from his responsibilities and from the electorate. Well, let's also focus for a moment here on this guidance from Dr. Dercum, because the only source we actually have for that is Edith Wilson. it would be about 20 years after this meeting supposedly took place with Dr. Dercum that her memoirs came out, which notably came out after Dercum had died and after Cary Grayson had died. In fact, Dr. Grayson had died just a few months before Edith Wilson finally decided to publish her memoir. So there was no one left to refute this guidance that Dr. Dercum had provided. But if you look through his documentation, the papers that Dr. Dercum kept, which was in pretty good detail, there's nothing like this in any of that documentation. Nothing about the League, nothing about the Treaty of Versailles or public policies or things like that. It was what you would expect. It was almost entirely about medical observations and diagnoses. The same for Dr. Cary Grayson, who had correspondence with Dr. Dercum. Was there anything between them about this guidance that Edith Wilson should play this stewardship role? And again, there's nothing in the written record to that effect. Again, mostly detailed memos and documentation medically, for medical purposes only. So what was Edith Wilson's role and why did she do it? Was this a spousal coup? Was she becoming the first female president of the United States? Well, we don't know that. But we do have questions, I think legitimate questions, about whether or not Dr. Dercum actually gave her this counsel, whether or not she came up with it on her own. She maybe took the words a little bit differently. For that, frankly, we'll never know because, again, it's all shrouded with mystery with no corroborating evidence. What we do know was that Woodrow Wilson became an invalid, and he was that really for the rest of his presidency, which had well over a year to go. According to Ike Hoover, who was the chief usher at the time at the White House, there was never a moment during all the time that when he was more than a shadow of his former self. He had changed from a giant to a pygmy in every wise. He was physically and almost incapacitated. He could articulate but indistinctly and think but feebly. So kind of cautionary remarks about the man who was still the President of the United States. Now, some folks in here around the president wanted more access, like the cabinet, which was completely shut out. The leader in this regard was Secretary of State Robert Lansing. He wanted to see the president. He wanted to see for himself how he was doing, and he was denied access. So he actually went to see Joe Tumulty, the president's personal secretary, and Dr. Grayson with a copy of the Constitution in hand. And he talked about Article 2, Section 1, which talked about the inability of the president to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, and what should happen with the vice president taking over in that case. But the problem back then was there was no 25th Amendment yet, come on, decades later. So who was to decide actually whether or not there was an inability to discharge the office if President Wilson wasn't going to make that decision himself? Well, Lansing suggested that maybe Tumulty and Grayson could make some kind of a public declaration. After all, they knew the president the best. They were on the inside. They could come out, put this constitutional provision into effect. Well, they said no chance. They closed ranks around the president. There would be no access to the cabinet. They were not going to make any kind of a statement along these lines. Lansing actually started calling some cabinet meetings. He wanted to perhaps give the semblance that government was going forward, maybe make some decisions as a group, even if they couldn't get access to the president. The president of the United States found out about this, and he shut him down. He said, you guys can't call cabinet meetings unless I call them. Whoever gave that order, it certainly came from the word or the desk of the president of the United States, and those meetings stopped. So did Secretary Lansing's tenure in the cabinet. He was fed up, frustrated beyond belief. He tendered his resignation, and the Wilsons were glad to accept it with good riddance. In the meantime of all of this, there was still the vote pending on the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations in the United States Senate, scheduled for November the 19th. Senator Gilbert Hitchcock was actually the administration's representative, the Democrat, a leader in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he was granted unique access to go see the president and have a final conversation leading into this vote. What did Hitchcock learn from the president? Well, I am merely told the president will not budge an inch. His honor is at stake, Hitchcock said. He feels he would be dishonored if he failed to live up to the pledges made to his fellow delegates in Paris. So what did that mean? What was going to happen with the vote? It was going down. It was either going to go with reservations or not, and since the president was not going to accept any reservations or amendments, this thing no longer had any chance of passage, and Henry Cabot Lodge, the chief opponent in the Senate, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, laid all the blame at the feet of Woodrow Wilson. He said that Wilson, was so set upon having his own way that he was ready to destroy the Treaty of Versailles, which was framed to replace a victorious war with a victorious peace. rather than permit any modification in the terms of the League of Nations, which he had identified with himself. Lodge was saying this was a personal vendetta, that Wilson was refusing to do this on his own personal rationale, and because of that, the treaty went down. It wasn't totally dead. There was still movement to try to see if they could find some way to maybe have a subsequent vote. And over the next couple of months, those negotiations continued. And in March of 1920, a new vote was scheduled. And one of the people coming to town to try to lobby to get this thing passed was a Republican by the name of William Taft. The former president came to D.C. to talk to the other Republicans like Lodge and said, look, let's put our differences aside, get this thing passed, because Taft had been a supporter of this notion of a league, an international league, for even before Wilson did. So he's there lobbying, and he said to these guys, look, I don't like Wilson any better than you do, but I think I can rise above my personal attitude in order to help along the world and the country. I beg you, consider the consequences if you defeat the treaty. We are inside of the promised land. Don't prevent our reaching there. He was trying to get the Republicans on board, but they were looking to Wilson. Would he take any amendments? Would he take any of those reservations? And Wilson continued to say no. We cannot rewrite this treaty, Wilson said. We must take it without changes of it which alter its meaning or leave it in them. After the rest of the world have signed it, we must face the unthinkable task of making another and separate kind of treaty with Germany. They're still completely at odds. The vote was going to come then, and not surprisingly, it went down to defeat. Of all those sacrifices and concessions that Wilson was willing to make in Paris on some of his other 14 points to get the League of Nations as he wanted it, he was unwilling to make any concessions or negotiations with the United States Senate. It went down to defeat, a bitter pill for Wilson to swallow. As he said to Joe Tumulty, they have shamed us in the eyes of the world, once again blaming others. But look, this was the biggest failure of Woodrow Wilson's life. He's not solely to blame for it not going through, but a lot of this did go back to, look, he did not allow any Republicans on his delegation to the peace conference in France. He didn't do any negotiating with them. There was really no movement from Wilson's side, and he was not operating in a parliamentary system where the prime minister, as much as he would have liked to have been, can simply go and negotiate a treaty on his own. That's not the system he was in, but he refused to play the game of politics in the United States, and his treaty and his League of Nations, as far as the U.S. was concerned, went down to defeat. The question should be asked, could that have been avoided? And I think the answer is at least perhaps. There were three things that were creating the problem between Wilson and Lodge on the treaty. The first from Wilson was no amendments. He had made an agreement, and the last thing he wanted to do was go back to all the countries that had signed the Treaty of Versailles and say, you know what, we've got amendments, you've got to relook at this and sign again. He was not going to do that. So any concessions he made had to be within the construct of the treaty that had already passed. That was Wilson's view. Henry Cabot Lodge had two concerns. The first was about the sovereignty of the United States and a foreign group like the League of Nations making a decision to impose war on the United States that they would have to go fight, ostensibly without their approval. The second problem that Lodge had was that this was taking power away from the constitutional authority of the U.S. Congress, because only Congress could declare war, and the person sitting in council at the League of Nations for the United States would be a member of the executive branch, and that could take away the rights, the unique rights handed to the Congress in terms of declaring war. So let's take each of these in turn. The first one about Lodge's concern about the sovereignty of the United States was basically nonsense. The League of Nations had in its construct that the council, the 9-member council, was the only group that could make this decision about sending force, declaring war, if you will, against a rogue state on behalf of the League of Nations. But they could only do that with a unanimous vote of the council. The United States had a permanent seat on that council, so there was no way for the League of Nations to take the United States into war without the United States concurring. So that was really a red herring. Lodge did have a point, though, on the rights of Congress, because again, it would be the executive branch of the United States that would be sitting in that council, and if they voted yes, then that seemingly could make the United States have to go to war without the Congress weighing in, taking away their constitutional responsibility. But there was an answer to this as well. If they had just gone down the path that the framers had given in Article 5, a constitutional amendment to adjust this one piece. It already says in the Constitution that the executive branch can't go to war without a declaration from the Congress. The same thing could apply with explicit language in the constitutional amendment to say that the United States can't go to war on behalf of any international body unless the United States Congress has voted for it first. The way that could be scripted is that if a vote was going to come to the Council of the League of Nations when it came to actually sending troops into battle, before the United States would decide how to vote, it would have to turn that vote over to the United States Congress. The House would weigh in, the Senate would weigh in. If they say, yes, we'll go to war, then the United States could vote yes in the Council. If they said no, or they didn't vote on it, then the United States would have to vote no. This would be a lot further for Woodrow Wilson than what he got. It wouldn't be perfect because in his view, that might slow things down. But the fact is these decisions are not made on a dime. They tend to be brought up over time. There's going to be a scheduled vote in the Council. You just need to call upon the United States Congress via this amendment to vote first to provide that guidance. In this case, that did not have to go, that was not an amendment or a reservation to the Treaty of Versailles, because this was just about how the United States itself was going to decide how it would vote on certain things. So Wilson's concern about amendments was gone, the whole sovereignty issue was gone, and the issue in terms of the Congress still having its authority to declare war, that problem was gone. Now, someone could argue that, well, constitutional amendments are too hard, but the truth is, in this era, there were several of them that had just passed. The 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments had all passed in about the 10-year period. So this was not an unusual thing to try to put something like that on the table. Seemingly could have addressed all of the issues. Doesn't seem like it was ever even discussed. The sides were locked in. Creative solutions like this didn't seem to come forward. The treaty went down. The League of Nations went down for the United States. Not only that, so there's no treaty, there's no league, and practically there's no president. He was physically unable to perform the duties of that office, really for the balance of his term. But believe it or not, he was still thinking of running for a third term in office. But those are some stories for another day. That is Woodrow Wilson, and who's running the country from the life of Woodrow Wilson. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.